This is Module 10, Integration of Metabolism. In this video 10-4, Diabetes mellitus, I'm going to be talking about one of the major disorders that is represented as a dysregulation of normal glucose metabolism, diabetes. So what happens when all of the regulatory systems in place caused by your hormones start to fail? The result is a metabolic disorder characterized by elevated levels of blood glucose. So essentially, you're not able to import glucose from the bloodstream and into the body cells. This basically, so if you have high levels of glucose in the blood, but your body is either not producing insulin or not responding to insulin, then you essentially have plenty of glucose in your bloodstream, but it's not accessible. You can't actually use it because it's not in the cell. You can't use glucose until it's phosphorylated, and then finally you can do something with that. But if it's just floating around in your bloodstream and your cells cannot take it out to phosphorylate it, then you can't use it. Your cells think you are starving despite the fact that your blood glucose is very high. And so this is why diabetes is sometimes referred to as starvation in the midst of plenty. There are two types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes are individuals who cannot produce insulin. And so if they cannot produce insulin, then blood glucose levels will rise, and there's no hormone signal telling cells to pull glucose out of the blood and put it in the cell. Type 2 diabetes, also referred to as adult onset diabetes, is a reduced response to insulin. And so some people with type 2 diabetes in the early stages are actually making plenty of insulin, but the receptors responsible for responding to it are not listening anymore. And so you're producing, your blood glucose is going up, your insulin is being made, but your cells can't hear it because their receptors aren't working. Eventually, the pancreas will burn out through overproduction of insulin, and you will stop making insulin altogether as a late stage type 2 diabetic. So there's two different types of characteristics unique to type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is juvenile diabetes. You tend to be born with it. It might not, the typical age of onset is somewhere below 30 years, and it is variable. So you can be born with precursors to type 1 diabetes, which will set it off, in your early adulthood, or you can be infected with particular types of viruses that will result in an autoimmune disorder where you produce antibodies that attack your pancreas, and then you no longer can produce insulin. Or you can take a drug or a pharmaceutical drug that destroys your pancreas, and then you're not able to produce insulin. So those are chemical diabetics. Type 2 diabetes is usually happens after 30 years of age, and it's usually in response to obesity. So increasing, so your pancreas is still able to make insulin, at least initially when you're young and middle, fairly middle-aged, and then stops producing insulin since your cells have stopped listening to insulin. Type 1 diabetes is not associated with obesity. It's associated with either a genetic disorder or an infectious disease that causes an autoimmune disorder. Type 2 diabetes is associated with obesity very commonly. There's very low or undetectable amounts of insulin in the blood in a type 1 diabetic because they can't produce it. Type 2, it really depends. Early in the stages of type 2 diabetes, the body is producing very high amounts of insulin, and then eventually your pancreas burns out and stops producing insulin in the late stage. Trends of type 2 diabetes are rapidly increasing because obesity is rapidly increasing in many countries. So let's look at type 1 diabetes first. Usually type 1 diabetes is caused by, type 1 diabetes is caused by destruction of pancreatic beta cells, which are responsible for producing insulin. There is definitely a genetic link, although the specific genetic link is not yet understood. There have been a whole host of genes associated with the development of type 1 diabetes, but no one definitive link to any one of those particular genes. So it's still being worked out and still under investigation. It has been linked to exposure to different viruses in early childhood. So certain viral infections can result in the production of antibodies that attack and destroy your pancreas, your pancreatic B cells. And so what happens is, so here we have the pancreas. It's not able to produce insulin. And so there's increased blood glucose due to low insulin levels in the blood. Um, because insulin is low, your muscles are not able to pull glucose out of the bloodstream. Your muscles respond to insulin and then respond by increasing glucose transporters and pulling glucose out of the bloodstream. But since your muscles cannot use glucose, it will start to use fatty acids and produce high amounts of ketone bodies, which could result in ketoacidosis. Okay. So remember, there's no insulin, which would promote uptake. And so there are several metabolic consequences of type 1 diabetes. There's decreased glucose metabolism because there's no glucose in the cell. If there's no ability to uptake glucose, then there's no ability to trap it in the cell. There's decreased phosphorylation of glucose in the liver. If that's the case, then your liver responds by producing glucose. Your liver thinks you are starving. And so it will respond by increasing gluconeogenesis and increasing the breakdown of glycogen to put glucose into the bloodstream. But remember, glucose is already very high in the bloodstream. It's just that your liver doesn't know that. And so high glucose in the blood with no insulin to help it results in even higher blood glucose levels because your liver is dumping glucose into the blood. And so fasting is very dangerous for a type 1 diabetic. Normally, when fasting begins in a normal subject, your plasma glucose levels will start to decrease. So eventually your glucose will rise up after a meal. And then somebody who, a normal subject will start to reduce the amount of glucose in the bloodstream after a meal. However, a diabetic patient will have experienced an increase in blood glucose after a meal, and then a further increase in blood glucose since your liver is not able to use any of that, and your muscles are not able to use any of that. And so your liver responds by increasing glucose output, and then your blood glucose levels get even worse. Glucose then will end up in the kidneys a lot more often, causing excessive urination because of an imbalance in the osmolarity of the nephron. Excessive urination causes excessive thirst, and you feel hungry a lot because your hormones that are released in response to so your insulin is not being released, and your adipose tissue thinks that you are starving. And you start to utilize more fatty acids since you can't use glucose. So as your fatty acid stores start to decrease, you will release hunger hormones, which will increase your appetite. So as I sort of gave this away on the previous slide, but you increase the amount of lipid mobilization. So you're increasing the amount of lipolysis, which means you decrease the amount of stored lipids, and you decrease synthesis of tags in the liver because you need to utilize tags and do beta oxidation as a form of energy. That's going to increase acetyl-CoA, but without that's going to then increase the production of ketone bodies. That's going to increase oxidation of fatty acids and increase the amount of free fatty acids in the blood. And so type 1 diabetics actually tend to be underweight than overweight. It also will increase the catabolism of proteins since if you are utilizing all of your stored fatty acids and you have no other source of high energy molecules, you can't use glucose because your body doesn't know it's there. You've used all of your fatty acids as a way to keep your brain going. And so now you're going to start to increase your catabolism of proteins also. Ketoacidosis is really common in type 1 diabetics since ketone bodies will start to accumulate as more fatty acids are released and oxidized as a form of energy because you can't use glucose. Ketone bodies are acidic. They are acidic products of fatty acid oxidation. And so if you keep increasing the amount of ketone bodies by doing high amounts of fatty acid oxidation, this could result in an accumulation of the acidic byproducts in the blood and will drop the pH of the blood. And so the reason for this is because your brain doesn't respond to insulin. It's always able to use glucose in your bloodstream. But your liver and your adipose tissue think your brain must be starving because they interpret the situation as no glucose around. And so, in order to rescue the brain, the liver and adipose tissue will start to release fatty acids, and then the liver will produce ketone bodies. And so, ketone bodies aren't going to be used by the brain. Your brain is still able to use the glucose that's there. And so, these ketone bodies will start to build up because they're not being used by anything, or they're not being used by the brain, which is what the liver is trying to get to happen. And so your blood pH can drop because of the accumulation of these ketone bodies, and then coma can be the result. Type 1 diabetics are on injectable insulin are at very high risk for hypoglycemia, or very low blood sugar. And the reason why is because, okay, so a type 1 diabetic needs insulin as a treatment. That's the only way to rescue this problem. If you introduce insulin to the body, then your insulin receptors will bind it, and then you can return your glucose metabolism back to normal. So insulin treatments lowers blood sugar because your cells finally can uptake and utilize that glucose. That's great. Usually, though, when blood sugar drops, glucagon is released, which stimulates glucose release by the liver, but insulin suppresses glucagon release, and insulin that's injectable is not subject to the normal regulation, the normal balance. And so insulin and glucagon are in a very delicate balance of high insulin, low glucagon, low insulin, high glucagon. However, exogenous insulin, because it's coming from an outside source and not a cellular source, is not regulated in the same way. So you may not get, so if insulin levels if you inject insulin and then glucose levels start to drop, there isn't always the same glucagon release. So there's reduced or absent glucagon released um, in response to glucose dropping significantly through the injection of insulin. And so if this happens, and glucagon is not released in response to low blood sugar, so high blood sugar, we inject insulin, that's going to reduce blood sugar, but then glucagon isn't going to signal to the liver to bring it back up again because it's not, outside insulin is not regulated the same way. And so because of that, glucose levels will continue to drop as long as there's exogenous insulin circulating. And that will result in extremely low blood sugar and seizures and things like that. And so blood glucose, diet, medications, and lifestyle are very tightly, closely monitored in type 1 diabetics because they're at such high risk of hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is blood sugar is so low that your brain has nothing to use, and you get seizures and comas. Okay, now let's talk about type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is linked to obesity and overnutrition. So what happens here essentially is you're messing with your set point. Your set point ensures that the proper hormones are released when you have plenty of energy stored in your adipose tissue. But those hormones that say stop eating can be very easily ignored, especially if we live in countries where there's really delicious sugars and fats all over the place. And so what happens is more and more people are able to ignore that satiety signal, the signal that says stop eating, in favor of consuming delicious ice cream sundaes and really delicious candy at Halloween. So more people are experiencing overnutrition, where they have too much high energy molecules circulating. This means you have a constant level of insulin circulating, and eventually your body will reset what it listens to. So if you have high insulin all the time, your body will respond by thinking high insulin is the normal situation. And so we'll only respond to even higher amounts of insulin produced by the pancreas. And so more people are developing type 2 diabetes due to overnutrition, so the accessibility of high calorie food, obesity, and inactivity as we switch more from laboring jobs to desk jobs. And so our energy expenditure is not very high, but our energy intake is very high. And so we throw off the balance of our set point. People are also living longer with type 2 diabetes because of treatments and better care of complications. And so more and more people develop diabetes and then they live longer, contributing to an increase in that statistic. This is the progression of type 2 diabetes. Here we have a normal fasting blood glucose level. And so that should be pretty steady, your blood glucose levels after a 2-hour after like a 2 to 4 hour fast. Okay, so normal fasting blood glucose levels are under normal fasting situations. We have this level of blood glucose, we have insulin production at a steady rate, and we have insulin resistance at a steady rate. This is your normal situation. Pre-diabetes is a situation where blood sugar is on the rise. So your blood sugar is increasing because you are constantly producing high levels of insulin in response to high levels of energy intake. So you're consuming too much sugar, you're consuming too much fat, and so your insulin production is always up. Okay. If your insulin levels are always up, this means that your receptors are constantly responding to this high level of insulin. And so what happens is you will just, your receptors become insensitive to it. And so it sort of sounds like loud music is playing all the time. And so it's going to sort of decrease the signal there by not listening as much. And so your receptors stop responding to this high level of insulin, sort of resetting like, okay, so our normal insulin level must be somewhere around here. When that happens and you continue your poor lifestyle habits of eating too much glucose and fat, you will then produce even more insulin in response because your receptors aren't listening. So your pancreas responds by producing even more insulin. And then your receptors will respond by listening even less. And so this problem gets worse and worse the more you are constantly supplying the body with high energy molecules. And so eventually your resistance level gets to a point where it stabilizes, but your insulin production starts to go down as your beta cell function starts to go down. And so your beta cells will start to kind of burn out from an overproduction of insulin. And then that will make your blood glucose levels even worse. So that will increase glucose levels even worse because now insulin is not present at all. And so the treatment for type 2 diabetes is to fix the receptor because you're initially still producing plenty of insulin. It's not until uncontrolled diabetes in its late stages starts to reduce insulin production. One reason that obesity can lead to insulin resistance has to do with a concept called the lipid burden hypothesis. So basically, as you start to increase the amount of adipose tissue storage, if you are consuming the proper amount of fatty acids, your adipose tissue has somewhat of an upper limit for storing fats. And so your adipose tissue, when it's doing this, is making lots of hormones like leptin saying, hey, stop eating so much. We've got plenty of fatty acids stored in the adipose tissue. In an obese individual, your adipose tissue and your capacity for lipid storage actually starts to decrease because you're reaching the upper limit of your ability to store fats in the adipose tissue. And so you'll actually start to store fat in and around the liver, resulting in what's called fatty liver. This is a problem that's going to disrupt the normal capacity of your liver function. And so insulin resistance is also linked to a disruption in leptin sensitivity also. So the same problem happens. If you are constantly adding fatty acids to your adipose tissue and your adipose tissue is constantly producing leptin, eventually your leptin receptors will just stop listening, assuming that there's something broken, leptin is just on all the time for some reason. And so you stop listening to those signals. And so you don't get the benefit of the behavioral changes in the brain and the tissue metabolism changes from adiponectin either. And so there's a disruption of leptin production, leptin receptor and adiponectin receptor. Those two hormones are circulating all the time, and so the receptors essentially stop listening to those two hormones. And so the treatment for type 2 diabetes is sort of fix the receptor problem with a drug called metformin. This works by decreasing glucose production by the liver and increasing insulin sensitivity of insulin receptors. And so you fix the listening problem. And so if you can fix the listening problem, the next step is to fix the signal. Stop producing so much insulin. And the way that you stop producing so much insulin is through energy expenditure. So increase your exercise, and that's going to decrease your fatty acid synthesis. That will increase your fatty acid oxidation because your muscles are going to use fatty acids when you're doing exercise. And that will increase your glucose uptake also because now your receptors are working again. And so you just have to restore the malfunctions caused by the insulin resistance problem. So fix the receptors, get them listening again, and then fix your lifestyle so that you're not producing so much insulin in response to so much high energy molecule consumption. And so that means reduce the amount of fatty acids that are stored by exercising and weight loss, reduce the lipid burden on your liver, increase the capacity for your lipid storage, which will also help your insulin sensitivity. Um, and so the initial treatment for type 2 diabetes is usually fix the receptor problem. However, if you're in the very late stages of diabetes, you're no longer able to produce insulin. And so you have to take metformin and also injectable insulin if you've let this go too far. And so a lot of times pre-diabetics will be put on metformin as a way to correct their insulin resistance, but they don't also correct their behavior through weight loss and exercise. And so taking metformin on its own without also doing lifestyle changes, all that means is that you eventually the metformin's ability to get your receptors listening will be overcome by just still high levels of insulin production. So you have to fix two things with a type 2 diabetics. You have to decrease that insulin production through weight loss and exercise, and you have to increase your insulin sensitivity by getting your receptors listening again.